Hi friends! Today we're diving into some of the creepiest jobs from history, real professions that actually existed and still give people chills. So get comfy, leave a like and subscribe if you enjoy dark tales like this. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Dim the lights and let your imagination take over. Let's begin. The Taster's Shadow, a memoir from the court of Rameses III, 1184 BCE, 1153 BCE, Thebes and Pi-Rameses, Egypt. Imagine the weight of a pharaoh's life resting on your tongue. Picture yourself standing in the shadows of towering limestone columns, carved with hieroglyphs that spell out divine protection, while knowing that your next swallow might be your last. This was my existence for 31 years, in the court of Rameses III, the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, where I served as his primary food taster, a position that meant living perpetually balanced on the razor's edge between life and death. My name was Kiti, though few bothered to remember it. To most, I was simply the taster, a necessary shadow in the elaborate machinery of royal survival. But shadows have eyes, and mine witnessed the slow decay of an empire, the paranoia that ate at a god-king's heart, and the intimate terror of swallowing uncertainty 3 times a day for over 3 decades. The selection. The year was 1184 BCE when they chose me. I was 17, the son of a minor scribe in the temple of Ptah at Memphis. My body lean from the sparse rations that marked our station. The royal surveyors had come seeking candidates for the pharaoh's household, not for glory, but for the positions that required expendable lives. They examined our teeth like livestock, pressed their fingers into our necks to feel for swollen glands, made us run in circles under the scorching sun to test our stamina. Imagine standing naked before these men, feeling their cold assessment as they decided whether your death would be convenient for the crown. They selected 12 of us that day, though I would later learn that only I survived the first year. The others succumbed to various poisons during their probationary period, some dying within hours, their bodies convulsing on the polished limestone floors of the testing chambers, others lingering for days as unknown toxins devoured them from within. The journey north to Pi-Rameses took 8 days by barge along the Nile. The royal city rose from the delta like a jeweled vision, its walls gleaming white under the relentless sun, its towers crowned with gold that blazed like captured fire. But beauty meant nothing to one destined to taste death for another man's peace of mind. The captain of the palace guard, a weathered Nubian named Amenemheb, with ritual scars covering his cheeks, explained my duties with mechanical precision as we approached the royal docks. "You will taste everything that touches the pharaoh's lips," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had delivered this speech many times before. Food, wine, water, even the oils used to anoint his body before ceremonies. You will do this willingly, knowing that your death serves the stability of Egypt. The irony was not lost on me. I was to preserve a life by potentially sacrificing my own, yet I had no choice in the matter. Royal service was not a career one declined, especially not when that service involved the most intimate form of protection imaginable. The Palace of Shadows. Pi-Rameses was a city of contradictions, where unimaginable wealth existed alongside casual brutality. The royal palace complex sprawled across acres, its courtyards connected by corridors lined with painted reliefs depicting Rameses III's victories over the Sea Peoples and Libyans. The very walls celebrated life and conquest, yet death lurked in every goblet, every morsel of food, every drop of ceremonial wine. My quarters were located in the servants' wing, a narrow chamber with walls of sun-dried brick and a single window that looked out onto a courtyard where the royal cats prowled. The room contained a sleeping mat, a wooden chest for my few possessions, and a small shrine to Thoth, where I prayed each morning for the wisdom to detect poison and the strength to survive another day. The chest held little: a spare kilt of coarse linen, a bronze razor, a small mirror of polished copper, and the amulets my mother had pressed into my hands before I left Memphis. Picture yourself waking each dawn, knowing that death might come with breakfast. The first light filtering through my window carried no promise of safety, only the certainty that I would soon be summoning every sense to distinguish between nourishment and destruction. The servants who brought my own meals, ironically safer than anything I would consume in service, spoke in hushed tones, as if my presence reminded them of their own mortality. The wine's colour appeared normal in the flickering lamplight, but the moment it touched my lips, the characteristic tingling began. Mercury compounds, often introduced through cosmetics or oils rather than food, created a different category of threat entirely. These substances attack the nervous system gradually, causing tremors and madness before eventual death. I learned to detect them through their effect on my saliva production and the way they made my teeth feel unusually sensitive. Twice during Rameses III's reign, assassins attempted to poison the oils used in his daily anointing ritual, requiring me to test each unguent by rubbing it on my forearms and waiting to see if my skin developed the telltale rash that marked mercurial contamination. The most insidious category consisted of plant-based toxins derived from Egypt's own flora. Castor beans, processed incorrectly, could produce ricin in concentrations lethal enough to kill within days, while initially causing only mild gastric distress. Lotus seeds, if allowed to ferment in specific conditions, developed compounds that affected the heart's rhythm. Even common foods like figs or dates could be treated with extracts from toxic plants, creating weapons that appeared entirely innocent until consumed. Imagine carrying this knowledge as a constant burden, knowing that every meal might contain a dozen different methods of death, each requiring different detection techniques and presenting unique dangers. I developed rituals to help organize this deadly expertise, specific sequences for testing different types of food, particular attention to unusual colors or textures, systematic evaluation of smells and tastes that might indicate tampering, the weight of service. The psychological toll of serving as a royal food taster extended far beyond the physical risks of potential poisoning. Every day brought fresh reminders of my expendability, of the fact that my death would be regrettable but not unexpected. The palace staff treated me with a mixture of respect and pity, recognizing my importance while understanding that I was essentially a living sacrifice in waiting. Loneliness became my constant companion. Other servants maintained careful distances, perhaps fearing that association with someone marked for death might somehow contaminate them with similar fate. The guards who escorted me to meals spoke in professional tones, but never engaged in casual conversation, Even the slaves who cleaned my quarters worked quickly and silently, avoiding eye contact as if I were already a ghost. The physical effects of constant low-level poisoning gradually accumulated over the years. My stomach lining, subjected to regular doses of various toxins, developed a chronic inflammation that caused persistent pain and made it difficult to enjoy any food, even when I was certain of its safety. My hands developed a slight tremor, possibly from accumulated mercury exposure that became more pronounced during periods of stress. My hair, once thick and black, thinned prematurely and developed streaks of grey before I reached my 25th birthday. Sleep provided little refuge from the constant tension. Dreams often featured elaborate banquets, where every dish transformed into crawling serpents or crumbling bones as I lifted them to my mouth. I would wake with my heart pounding, immediately reaching for the water jug beside my bed to wash away the imaginary taste of poison that lingered even in unconsciousness. The darkness of my chamber felt oppressive during these midnight moments, filled with shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. Yet perhaps most disturbing was the gradual numbing of my emotional responses to danger. After months of facing potential death several times daily, the acute fear that had initially accompanied each meal began to fade into a dull acceptance. This psychological adaptation was necessary for survival, but it left me feeling disconnected from my own humanity, as if I were becoming more instrument than person. The royal paranoia remesses. The third's fear of assassination was not mere neurosis, but a rational response to the genuine threats that surrounded his throne. The later years of his reign coincided with upheavals throughout the Mediterranean world, as the mysterious sea peoples swept across established civilizations like a plague of locusts. Egypt had survived their initial assault, but the victory came at enormous cost, draining the treasury and straining the loyalty of provincial governors, who found it increasingly difficult to collect taxes from their impoverished territories. Internal pressures compounded these external threats. The priesthood of Amun at Thebes commanded wealth and influence that rivaled the pharaoh's own resources, while regional administrators grew increasingly autonomous as communication with the capital became sporadic. Palace servants reported conversations overheard in corridors, fragments of discussion that suggested plots forming in the shadows of royal authority. The pharaoh's meals became elaborate productions designed as much for security as sustenance. Multiple cooks prepared each dish, with different individuals responsible for various ingredients to prevent any single person from contaminating an entire meal. Kitchen servants were searched before and after their duties, their bodies examined for hidden containers that might hold poisons or other dangerous substances. Guards watched from concealed positions as food moved from preparation areas to the royal table, creating overlapping fields of observation that made tampering theoretically impossible. Yet assassins adapted to these precautions with ingenuity that matched the security measures designed to stop them. Poisons were introduced into ingredients during their transport from farms to palace kitchens, making detection nearly impossible until someone actually consumed the contaminated food. Servants were recruited or coerced into cooperation through threats against their families, creating networks of potential saboteurs that extended far beyond the palace walls. Some attempts involved introducing slow-acting toxins that would not manifest symptoms until hours or days after consumption, making it difficult to identify either the source or method of poisoning. Picture yourself as the final barrier against these elaborate schemes, knowing that your vigilance stood between the stability of an empire and the chaos that would follow a successful assassination. The pressure was immense, made worse by the knowledge that failure meant not just personal death, but potentially the collapse of everything our civilization represented. The rituals of detection. My techniques for detecting poisons evolved through bitter experience, developing into rituals as complex and meaningful as any temple ceremony. Each morning began with preparation designed to maximize my sensory acuity, starting with washing my mouth with a solution of salt water and crushing mint leaves between my teeth to clear any residual tastes from the previous day. The physical examination of food required systematic attention to details that others might dismiss as insignificant. Color variations in bread crust could indicate the presence of additives, while unusual crystalline deposits on fruits might suggest surface contamination. I learned to recognize the subtle differences between natural fermentation aromas and the chemical signatures of various toxins, developing an olfactory vocabulary that could distinguish dozens of potentially dangerous substances. Timing played a crucial role in effective detection. Most plant-based poisons required several minutes to register their effects, meaning I had to consume test portions and wait through anxious intervals before declaring food safe for royal consumption. During these waiting periods, I would monitor my body's responses, changes in heart rate, variations in saliva production, unusual sensations in my extremities that might indicate the beginning of poisoning symptoms. Temperature sensitivity proved particularly important when testing liquids. Certain toxins became more detectable when heated, while others were more easily identified when cooled. I developed the habit of requesting both hot and cold versions of any drink intended for the pharaoh, testing each temperature to maximize the chances of catching potentially dangerous additives. The most challenging aspect of my duties involved distinguishing between harmless, unusual flavors and genuinely dangerous contamination. Egyptian cuisine incorporated exotic spices and ingredients imported from across the known world, creating legitimate flavor combinations that could easily be confused with poison markers. Fermented fish sauces from distant shores produced intense tastes that might mask toxins, while rare honeys from specific regions carried natural compounds that mimicked the effects of certain plant alkaloids. The architecture of survival pyromesses itself became a character in this long drama of survival, its physical spaces shaped by the constant need to protect its divine ruler from threats both foreign and domestic. The palace complex had been designed during more optimistic times, when Egypt's power seemed unshakable and royal security focused more on ceremony than assassination prevention. But 3 decades of increasing danger had transformed these spaces into an elaborate fortress disguised as a residence. Corridors that once facilitated easy movement between different sections of the palace had been modified with hidden alcoves where guards could observe passing traffic without being seen. The royal kitchens, originally located in a separate building connected to the main palace by covered walkways, had been moved to basement chambers directly beneath the dining areas to minimize the distance food had to travel and reduce opportunities for tampering. My own daily routes through this modified architecture followed patterns designed to prevent potential assassins from predicting my movements with enough accuracy to plan effective ambushes. I would approach the royal dining area through different entrances on alternating days, sometimes passing through courtyards filled with morning sunlight, other times navigating narrow passages lit only by oil lamps, whose flickering flames created dancing shadows on walls decorated with images of eternal life and divine protection. The irony of these protective modifications was not lost on those of us who lived within them daily. In trying to make the palace safer, the architects had created an environment that felt increasingly prison-like, where every space carried an undercurrent of suspicion and every person might be a potential threat. The beauty of Egyptian art and architecture remained, but it now served as decoration for what had essentially become an elaborate trap designed to catch assassins before they could reach their target. Storage areas for food and drink became particularly complex, with multiple sealed chambers protected by both physical barriers and magical wards. Priests performed protective rituals over supplies intended for royal consumption, invoking the gods' protection against both supernatural curses and mundane poisoning attempts. These ceremonies added layers of religious significance to what was fundamentally a practical security measure, but they also provided psychological comfort to everyone involved in the process of keeping the pharaoh alive. The taste of empire. Each meal I tested told a story about Egypt's place in the wider Mediterranean world, reflecting both the kingdom's enduring wealth and its increasing isolation as traditional trade relationships deteriorated. The royal table continued to feature delicacies imported from distant lands, but obtaining these luxuries required increasingly elaborate diplomatic and military efforts, as old allies became unreliable and familiar trade routes grew dangerous. Spices from Punt arrived irregularly when ships managed to navigate past pirates and hostile coastlines that had become more common as central authorities weakened throughout the region. The distinctive flavor of cinnamon bark and the sharp heat of black pepper became precious commodities, valued not just for their culinary properties, but as symbols of Egypt's continued ability to project power beyond its borders. Wine represented perhaps the most complex category of imported luxury. The pharaoh's cellars contained amphorae from vineyards across the Mediterranean, each sealed container marking a specific vintage and origin that told stories about diplomatic relationships and trade agreements. Wines from Cyprus carried the taste of an island struggling to maintain independence between competing empires, while vintages from Syria reflected the chaos consuming that once prosperous region as various peoples fought for control of its cities. Testing these imported delicacies required knowledge that extended far beyond simple poison detection. I had to understand the legitimate characteristics of foods from different regions to distinguish between authentic foreign flavors and potentially dangerous adulterations. A wine that tasted unusual might be contaminated with toxins, or it might simply come from an unfamiliar vineyard using different grape varieties or fermentation techniques. The most poignant meals were those featuring foods from Egypt's own provinces, regions that had once supplied the royal table as a matter of routine, but now struggled to meet their obligations due to economic pressures and administrative breakdown. Dates from oases in the western desert arrived sporadically and often showed signs of poor preservation, suggesting that local governors lacked either the resources or motivation to maintain previous standards of quality. The weight of years. By the 15th year of my service, the accumulated stress of constant vigilance had begun to transform me in ways that extended beyond physical deterioration. My senses, honed by years of detecting subtle indicators of danger, had become almost supernaturally acute. I could distinguish between different types of honey based on the specific flowers visited by the bees that produced them, identify the origin of wine by noting variations in mineral content that reflected different soil compositions, and detect trace amounts of salt that indicated whether fish had been caught in the Nile or imported from Mediterranean waters. Yet this heightened sensitivity came with its own burdens. Foods that others enjoyed without thought became complex puzzles requiring careful analysis before consumption. Even when I was certain of safety, meals had lost their simple pleasure, transformed into technical exercises in chemical detection and risk assessment. The act of eating, which should have provided basic comfort and satisfaction, became another form of work that reminded me constantly of my unusual and dangerous profession. Sleep patterns, disrupted by years of anxiety and the physical effects of accumulated toxin exposure, settled into irregular cycles that left me chronically exhausted. Dreams filled with elaborate banquets where food transformed into dangerous creatures or dissolved into poisonous liquids became so common that I began to dread the unconscious hours as much as my waking duties. Herbal preparations that might have helped with insomnia were denied to me, since anything that affected my consciousness could potentially interfere with my ability to detect poisons. The social isolation that had marked my early years in palace service deepened as other servants came to view me as somehow cursed or touched by forces that made normal human relationships impossible. Conversations became stilted exercises in politeness rather than genuine communication, as if my constant proximity to death had created an invisible barrier that separated me from the ordinary concerns and pleasures of daily life. Personal relationships remained impossible for reasons that extended beyond social stigma. What woman would willingly attach herself to someone whose death was expected as a matter of professional routine? What friendships could develop with individuals who viewed me primarily as a walking reminder of mortality? The palace contained hundreds of people, but I moved through it as essentially alone, as if I had been exiled to the desert. The conspiracy unveiled. The 23rd year of my service brought the crisis that had been building throughout Ramesses III's reign. Palace tensions, which had simmered for years like oil heating in a bronze vessel, finally erupted into open conspiracy as various factions united around the goal of removing the pharaoh and replacing him with a ruler more amenable to their interests. The plot centered around Queen T, one of Ramesses III's secondary wives, who sought to elevate her son Pentaweret to the throne by eliminating both the pharaoh and the designated heir. The conspiracy drew support from officials who felt overlooked for advancement, military commanders frustrated by Egypt's increasingly defensive posture, and priests who resented royal interference in temple affairs. The scope of participation was breathtaking, involving dozens of individuals in positions of trust throughout the palace hierarchy. Initial signs of the conspiracy manifested in subtle changes to daily routines that would have been invisible to casual observers, but stood out clearly to someone whose survival depended on recognizing patterns. Kitchen staff began working in different combinations than usual, breaking established procedures that had been developed specifically to prevent collaboration in poisoning attempts. Guards assigned to escort food from preparation areas to royal dining spaces started following slightly altered routes, creating new opportunities for tampering that had not existed previously. The most ominous development involved the sudden appearance of new servants in positions that provided access to royal food supplies. These individuals, supposedly recruited to replace workers who had died or been dismissed, carried credentials that appeared legitimate but felt somehow wrong to those of us who had spent years learning to detect deception. Their movements through palace corridors seemed too purposeful, their interactions with established staff too calculated, their overall presence too convenient, given the timing of their arrival. My own role in detecting the conspiracy began with a series of near-miss poisoning attempts that displayed sophistication beyond anything previously encountered. Someone was introducing toxins in combinations designed to create delayed reactions that might not manifest symptoms until hours after consumption, making it nearly impossible to identify either the source of contamination or the method used to introduce dangerous substances. The final test. The culmination of the conspiracy came during the festival of Opet, when religious ceremonies required the pharaoh to participate in elaborate banquets that stretched across multiple days and involved hundreds of participants. The festival's complexity, with its numerous ritual meals and ceremonial drinks, provided perfect cover for assassination attempts while making security precautions extremely difficult to maintain effectively. On the second evening of the festival, as temple musicians filled the air with hymns celebrating the gods' eternal protection of Egypt, I detected something wrong with the wine intended for the pharaoh's ceremonial toast. The vintage appeared normal, a deep red liquid from the Fayum region, sealed in an amphora bearing authentic marks, indicating its origin and age. But when I lifted the golden goblet to my lips for the required tasting, subtle wrongness registered on my palate, like a discordant note in otherwise perfect music. The poison was unlike anything I had encountered during my years of service. Instead of the familiar bitterness, metallic tastes, or numbing sensations that marked known toxins, this substance produced only the slightest alteration in the wine's natural flavor profile, so subtle that anyone not specifically trained in detection might have dismissed it as a minor variation in fermentation. But 3 decades of experience had taught me to trust instincts that operated below conscious thought, and every sense screamed danger despite the wine's apparently innocent characteristics. Picture that moment of terrible certainty, standing in a hall filled with hundreds of Egypt's most powerful individuals, holding a goblet that contained death, disguised so expertly that exposing the threat would require explaining distinctions too subtle for others to verify. The pharaoh waited on his throne, surrounded by priests and officials, whose patience for delayed ceremonies had already been tested by the evening's elaborate rituals. Guards watched with expressions that suggested they would not tolerate further disruptions to scheduled proceedings. I set the goblet aside and requested a replacement vintage, using the traditional formula that indicated suspected contamination without specifying details that might cause panic among the assembled guests. The request should have triggered immediate security protocols, with guards removing the suspect wine for detailed analysis, while kitchen staff provided alternative beverages from sealed containers stored in protected areas. Instead, several officials began objecting to further delays, insisting that the evening's ceremonies had already been disrupted enough by security precautions and demanding that the festivities continue without additional interruptions. Their protest carried an urgency that felt wrong, too immediate, and too coordinated to represent spontaneous frustration with ceremonial delays. The reckoning. The pattern of objections revealed the conspiracy's scope more clearly than any investigation could have accomplished. Those pushing most forcefully for the ceremony to continue included individuals from different court factions who had never previously cooperated on any issue, united now only by their apparent desire to see the pharaoh consume the contaminated wine. Their coordination was too perfect, their arguments too synchronized, their timing too convenient to represent anything other than predetermined collaboration. Palace guards, alerted by their unusual pattern of objections, began moving into positions that would allow them to control the situation if overt violence erupted. The tension in the Great Hall became palpable, with guests beginning to sense that something significant was happening despite the lack of explicit announcements. Conversations died away as people focused their attention on the drama unfolding around the pharaoh's throne, creating a silence that amplified every small sound. The shuffle of sandaled feet on limestone floors, the rustle of linen garments, the barely audible hiss of oil lamps burning overhead. Rameses III himself remained outwardly calm, his expression maintaining the divine composure required of a pharaoh even in moments of extreme crisis. But I could see the alertness in his eyes, the way his hands positioned themselves near the ceremonial dagger at his belt, the slight tension in his shoulders that indicated readiness for sudden action. He had survived as Egypt's ruler for over 2 decades by learning to recognize danger in all its forms, and the current situation clearly registered as a significant threat. The moment of decision came when one of the objecting officials stepped forward to argue directly with the pharaoh about ceremonial protocol, moving close enough to the throne to represent a physical threat. This breach of established etiquette triggered immediate responses from guards positioned throughout the hall, who moved to surround potential conspirators while maintaining positions that would protect the royal family if violence erupted. What followed was not the dramatic confrontation that scribes might later record for historical chronicles, but rather a series of careful arrests conducted with the precise efficiency that marked professional palace security operations. Individuals identified as conspiracy participants were quietly surrounded and escorted from the hall, their removal so skillfully managed that many guests remained unaware that anything unusual was occurring. The aftermath of discovery. The investigation that followed the festival arrests revealed the conspiracy's true scope, uncovering a network of participants that reached into every level of palace administration and extended throughout Egypt's provincial government structure. The plot against Rameses III had not been a simple palace coup, but rather a coordinated attempt to fundamentally reshape the kingdom's power structure, with various factions united temporarily around the goal of removing an obstacle to their ambitions. Queen Tyre and her supporters had planned to eliminate not just the pharaoh, but also his designated successors, clearing the way for her son Pentawaret to claim the throne with backing from military commanders who promised their support in exchange for policy changes that would favour their regional interests. Provincial governors had agreed to recognise the new ruler in return for increased autonomy that would essentially transform Egypt from a centralised kingdom into a loose confederation of semi-independent territories. The punishment phase of this conspiracy's resolution followed patterns established by centuries of Egyptian legal tradition, with different categories of participants receiving sentences proportional to their roles in the planned assassination. Queen Tiye and the primary organisers faced execution, while secondary participants were allowed to take their own lives to avoid the shame of public execution. Lower-level conspirators, judged to have been coerced rather than willing participants, received lesser punishments, including exile or assignment to labour gangs working on royal construction projects. My own role in detecting and disrupting the conspiracy earned recognition that felt more burdensome than rewarding. The pharaoh granted me gifts of gold and land that marked royal favour, but these rewards came with the implicit understanding that my service would continue indefinitely, binding me more firmly to a position that had already consumed the best years of my life. The palace atmosphere changed dramatically following the conspiracy's exposure, with security measures becoming even more elaborate and intrusive than they had been previously. Trust between different court factions, already strained by years of increasing pressures, deteriorated further as everyone wondered who among their colleagues might have harboured treasonous sympathies without being detected during the investigation. The price of vigilance. The years following the Great Conspiracy brought a different kind of tension to palace life, as the immediate threat of assassination gave way to the chronic stress of living under security measures designed to prevent any repetition of such organised betrayal. Every aspect of daily routine came under scrutiny, with procedures that had once been matters of convenience or tradition now viewed primarily through the lens of threat prevention. My own duties expanded beyond simple food testing to include participation in broader security evaluations that examined potential vulnerabilities throughout the royal household's operations. This additional responsibility required me to develop expertise in areas ranging from the reliability of supply chains that brought food to the palace to the psychological profiles of servants who had access to royal dining areas. The physical toll of nearly 3 decades spent testing potentially lethal substances had become increasingly difficult to ignore or manage through willpower alone. Chronic stomach pain, which had been a manageable discomfort during my earlier years of service, evolved into episodes of severe cramping that sometimes left me doubled over in agony for hours at a time. My hands, affected by accumulated exposure to various toxins, developed a persistent tremor that made fine motor tasks increasingly difficult. Sleep, disrupted for years by anxiety and the physical effects of poison exposure, became even more elusive as the conspiracy's revelation reinforced how many people within the palace had harboured murderous intentions toward the pharaoh. Dreams filled with images of familiar faces transformed into threatening masks haunted my rest, while waking hours brought constant reminders of how close the assassination attempt had come to succeeding. The social isolation that had marked my entire career in royal service deepened as other palace residents began viewing me with a mixture of respect and fear that made normal human interactions nearly impossible. My role in exposing the conspiracy had saved the pharaoh's life and possibly prevented civil war, but it had also marked me as someone whose attention could prove dangerous to anyone harboring secrets or questionable loyalties. The wisdom of survival. 3 decades of service as a royal food taster had taught me lessons about survival, loyalty, and the price of power that could never be learned from scrolls or scholarly instruction. I had witnessed the gradual erosion of an empire from a unique vantage point, observing how external pressures and internal divisions slowly weakened institutions that had seemed eternal and unshakable when I first entered palace service as a teenage recruit from Memphis. The knowledge I carried about poisons and their detection had become encyclopedic through necessity, encompassing not just the substances themselves, but also the psychology of those who use them and the political circumstances that made assassination attempts more or less likely. I could read the subtle signs that indicated increasing desperation among various court factions, recognize the environmental conditions that made food tampering more feasible, and anticipate the types of toxins that different categories of assassins were most likely to employ. But this expertise had come at costs that extended far beyond the obvious physical dangers of my profession. The constant vigilance required for effective poison detection had shaped my perception of the world in ways that made ordinary pleasures increasingly difficult to enjoy. Food, which should have provided basic comfort and satisfaction, remained forever tainted by professional skepticism. Wine, meant to facilitate social bonding and celebration, could never be consumed without careful analysis of its potential dangers. Relationships with other people had been complicated by my unusual role in ways that created barriers to normal human connection. The knowledge that my death was expected and even planned for as part of royal security made it difficult for others to view me as fully human, rather than simply a specialized tool designed for a specific purpose. Friendships felt hollow when they were built on the understanding that one participant might die at any moment without warning. The psychological impact of spending decades balanced on the edge between life and death had created a perspective on existence that felt simultaneously privileged and cursed. I had seen power exercised at its highest levels, witnessed the decision-making processes that shaped an empire, and observed the intimate details of how divine kingship functioned in practical terms. Yet these experiences had come at the cost of living a normal life, of forming the relationships and pursuing the interests that gave meaning to ordinary existence. The twilight of service. The final years of Ramesses, the Third's reign, brought changes that reflected Egypt's broader transformation from a dominant Mediterranean power to a kingdom focused primarily on preserving what remained of its ancient glory. The pharaoh himself, now in his 70s and bearing the accumulated weight of 3 decades, spent defending his throne against both foreign invasion and domestic conspiracy, began delegating more responsibilities to trusted advisors while maintaining personal control over the most sensitive aspects of royal authority. My own role evolved accordingly, with responsibilities shifting from active poison detection to training younger tasters who would eventually take over my duties while serving as a consultant on security matters that required the expertise gained through decades of experience. The prospect of retirement, which had seemed impossibly distant during my early years of service, gradually became a realistic possibility as suitable replacements were identified and trained to acceptable levels of competence. The process of transferring my knowledge to successors proved more complex than anyone had anticipated, requiring me to articulate insights that had been gained through instinct and experience rather than formal study. Teaching someone to detect poisons involved more than simply describing the taste or smell of various toxins. It required developing the psychological resilience necessary to consume potentially lethal substances multiple times daily, while maintaining the focus needed for accurate assessment. The 3 young men selected as my potential replacements came from backgrounds similar to my own, sons of minor officials or temple servants, chosen for their intelligence and physical constitution rather than any particular ambition for palace service. Watching them struggle with the same fears and uncertainties I had faced 30 years earlier brought back memories of my own early days, when every meal had felt like a test of courage as much as professional competence. Training sessions took place in chambers adjacent to the royal kitchens, where controlled doses of various substances could be administered under conditions that allowed for immediate medical intervention if reactions proved more severe than anticipated. The youngest trainee, a boy named Seneb, who reminded me painfully of my teenage self, showed particular difficulty adapting to the psychological pressures of the work. His hands would shake visibly as he lifted test portions to his mouth, and on several occasions, he vomited immediately after tasting substances that were actually harmless. Picture yourself trying to teach someone else to embrace their own potential death as a daily routine. The technical aspects of poison detection could be learned through repetition and careful observation, but the mental discipline required to function effectively under constant threat proved much more difficult to instill. Some individuals possessed natural resilience that allowed them to adapt quickly to dangerous circumstances, while others struggled to overcome instinctive self-preservation reflexes that made effective testing nearly impossible. The irony of my situation became increasingly apparent as I worked with these replacements. After spending 3 decades longing for freedom from the constant threat of death, I found myself reluctant to fully relinquish responsibilities that had defined my entire adult existence. The knowledge that I possessed about palace security and poison detection felt too valuable to risk losing through inadequate training or premature transition to less experienced personnel. The last feast. The final meal I tested for Ramesses III took place during the celebration of his 30th regnal anniversary, a milestone that few pharaohs had achieved during Egypt's increasingly turbulent period. The banquet was intended to demonstrate the kingdom's enduring strength and prosperity, despite mounting evidence that both were more appearance than reality. The royal dining hall had been decorated with particular splendor for the occasion. Its walls hung with tapestries depicting the pharaoh's victories, and its tables laden with the finest delicacies that Egypt's strained resources could provide. Imagine approaching this culminating moment of your career with emotions that mixed relief, nostalgia, and an unexpected sadness at leaving behind work that had been simultaneously terrifying and meaningful. The elaborate preparations for this anniversary celebration felt like a farewell to more than just my professional duties. They marked the end of an era during which I had served as witness to the intimate details of royal power during one of Egypt's most challenging periods. The meal itself featured dishes that represented the full scope of my experience as a food taster, from simple bread and beer that form the foundation of Egyptian sustenance to exotic delicacies imported from the farthest reaches of the known world. Each item I tested carried memories of similar foods encountered during different phases of Ramesses III's reign, creating a catalogue of flavours that told the story of an empire's gradual transformation under external pressure and internal strain. The wine selected for the pharaoh's final toast under my protection came from vineyards along the Nile that had supplied the royal court for generations. Their grapes nurtured by irrigation systems that represented some of humanity's greatest engineering achievements. As I lifted the golden goblet to perform my duties one last time, the irony struck me that this vintage, produced from vines that had grown in Egyptian soil, fermented according to techniques perfected over centuries, and stored in jars sealed with the traditional marks of authenticity, was probably safer than anything I had consumed during my decades of service. The taste was perfect. The complex sweetness of properly aged wine balanced with subtle tartness that indicated ideal fermentation conditions, carrying no trace of the metallic, bitter, or numbing sensations that had marked so many contaminated beverages over the years. For once, I could savor the flavor itself rather than analyzing it for signs of danger, allowing myself to appreciate the skill of vintners whose work had created something genuinely beautiful rather than potentially lethal. The weight of memory retirement from royal service brought freedoms I had not experienced since adolescence, along with challenges that no amount of preparation could have anticipated. The estate granted to me by Ramesses III in recognition of my service was located near Memphis, close enough to the temples of my youth to provide familiar surroundings, but far enough from the palace to offer genuine separation from the constant tensions that had shaped my adult life. The physical structure of my new home represented luxury beyond anything I had imagined during my years of palace service, with rooms spacious enough to accommodate furniture and possessions that could never have fit in the narrow servants' quarters where I had spent 3 decades. Gardens surrounding the main building provided space for growing vegetables and herbs, allowing me to experiment with cultivation techniques that gave me complete control over food production for the first time in my adult life. Yet the psychological adjustment to civilian life proved far more difficult than adapting to material comfort. Meals remained fraught with anxiety, despite my intellectual understanding that the food I now consumed posed no unusual dangers. My hands continued to shake slightly when lifting cups to my lips, and I found myself unconsciously analysing flavours and textures, even when eating bread I had baked myself from grain I had personally selected and stored. Sleep patterns, disrupted by decades of irregular schedules and constant stress, failed to normalize despite the absence of external pressures that had previously made rest difficult. Dreams continue to feature elaborate banquets where familiar foods transformed into dangerous substances, while waking hours brought phantom tastes and smells that my mind associated with various poisons encountered during my career. The accumulated psychological impact of 30 years spent expecting death with every meal could not be simply dismissed through retirement ceremonies and changes of residence. Social relationships remained challenging for reasons that extended beyond my own psychological adaptation difficulties. The reputation I had gained through royal service created a barrier to normal interaction with neighbours and acquaintances, who seemed unsure whether to treat me as a hero whose vigilance had protected the pharaoh, or as someone whose unusual profession had marked him as fundamentally different from ordinary people. Conversations often felt stilted and artificial, as if my presence reminded others of mortality and danger in ways that made casual friendship impossible. The isolation that resulted from these social difficulties was compounded by my inability to discuss the most significant experiences of my adult life without violating confidences that had been essential to effective palace security. The conspiracy I had helped expose, the assassination attempts I had thwarted, the intimate details of royal life I had witnessed, all remained secrets that I could never share, leaving me unable to process these experiences through normal conversation and human connection. The scribe's duty. The decision to record these memories came gradually, emerging from long evenings spent alone with thoughts that had no other outlet for expression. Writing provided a way to organize and preserve experiences that felt too significant to die with me, while also serving as a form of psychological therapy that helped process emotions and insights that had been suppressed during my years of active service. The physical act of writing proved more challenging than anticipated, as the tremor in my hands made it difficult to form the hieroglyphic characters with the precision required for clear communication. Learning to adapt my penmanship to accommodate this disability required patience and practice that reminded me of the long process of developing expertise in poison detection. Both skills demanded persistence in the face of obstacles that might have discouraged someone less motivated by necessity. The papyrus itself, purchased from scribes in Memphis who had supplied the temples during my youth, carried the familiar smell of reed pulp and natural adhesives that transported me back to childhood memories of watching my father practice his own writing exercises. These sensory connections to earlier, simpler times provided comfort during the difficult process of confronting traumatic experiences that I had never previously allowed myself to fully acknowledge or understand. Picture yourself trying to capture in words experiences that existed primarily as physical sensations, emotional responses, and intuitive knowledge gained through constant exposure to mortal danger. The inadequacy of language to convey the full reality of what it meant to serve as a royal food taster became apparent as I struggled to describe moments of terror, triumph, and resignation that had shaped my understanding of existence itself. The narrative structure that emerged from these writing sessions reflected the fragmented nature of memory itself, with certain incidents remaining vivid in their details, while others had blurred into general impressions of fear, vigilance, and gradual adaptation to circumstances that no human being should have to endure. The chronology of events became less important than capturing the psychological and emotional truth of what it meant to spend a lifetime balanced on the edge between service and sacrifice. The philosophy of survival. 3 decades of intimate proximity to death had taught me lessons about existence that could never be learned through scholarship or philosophical contemplation alone. The constant awareness of mortality that shaped every moment of my professional life had created a perspective on human experience that felt simultaneously precious and burdensome, offering insights into the nature of courage, loyalty, and meaning that came at the cost of normal participation in life's ordinary pleasures. The courage required for effective service as a food taster was not the dramatic bravery celebrated in stories of military heroism or religious martyrdom, but rather a quieter form of persistence that involved choosing to face potential death multiple times daily without the consolation of glory or public recognition. This everyday courage, practiced in the shadows of royal power, required psychological resources that had to be constantly renewed and maintained, despite the absence of external support or encouragement. Loyalty, which I had initially understood simply as obedience to royal authority, evolved through experience into a more complex commitment that encompassed not just personal duty to the pharaoh, but also responsibility to the stability and continuity of Egyptian civilization itself. My willingness to risk death for Ramesses III was ultimately motivated less by personal devotion than by understanding of the catastrophic consequences that would follow successful assassination of a pharaoh during such a turbulent period. The question of meaning, why my life had been shaped by such unusual circumstances, and what purpose had been served by decades of service that few would ever know about or understand, remained difficult to answer with confidence even in retirement. The conspiracy I had helped expose had almost certainly prevented civil war and foreign conquest. But the cost in personal terms felt enormous when measured against the normal experiences of family, friendship, and peaceful occupation that I had sacrificed. Yet there was also a strange pride in having played a crucial role in preserving something ancient and valuable during a period when so much of the Mediterranean world was collapsing into chaos and barbarism. Egypt's survival as an independent civilization, with its traditions of learning, art, and religious practice intact, represented an achievement that justified considerable personal sacrifice, even if that sacrifice would never be publicly acknowledged or celebrated. The final accounting. As I write these words in the 32nd year of Ramesses III's reign, the pharaoh himself has begun showing signs of age and illness that suggest his time on earth grows short. The irony is not lost on me that after spending decades protecting him from assassination, natural mortality will likely claim him before any human enemy can succeed where others have failed. The knowledge that my vigilance may have been ultimately unnecessary provides no comfort, since the threats I defended against were real regardless of whether they ultimately proved decisive. The kingdom I helped preserve through my service faces challenges that extend far beyond the reach of any individual's efforts to address. The Sea Peoples, though defeated in their initial assault on Egypt, continue to threaten established trade routes and diplomatic relationships throughout the Mediterranean. Internal pressures from ambitious provincial governors and powerful priesthoods show no signs of diminishing as central authority continues to weaken. The economic strains that made the recent conspiracy possible persist despite the removal of its primary organizers. My own legacy consists primarily of knowledge that will die with me and memories that can never be fully shared with others who lack the context to understand their significance. The younger tasters I trained may carry forward some of the technical expertise I developed, but the deeper insights gained through decades of service cannot be transferred through instruction alone. They must be earned through experience that I would not wish on anyone. The estate where I now live will eventually pass to distant relatives who will remember me, if at all, as an uncle who served at court and accumulated modest wealth through royal favour. The true nature of that service, and the price paid for the security it provided, will remain unknown to them, as it has been to virtually everyone throughout my career. Perhaps this anonymity is appropriate for work that was always intended to remain invisible and unacknowledged. Picture yourself at the end of such a life, possessing knowledge that could fill libraries, but unable to share most of it. Having witnessed events that shaped history while remaining officially absent from the records that will preserve that history for future generations. The satisfaction of duty fulfilled must be balanced against the cost of experiences that separated me from normal human community and left me psychologically marked in ways that retirement cannot entirely heal. The eternal taste. The physical effects of 3 decades spent testing poisons continue to manifest in ways that serve as daily reminders of my unusual career. My stomach, damaged by repeated exposure to various toxins, requires careful attention to diet that ironically makes eating, the fundamental human activity I spent years making safer for another, a source of chronic discomfort. The tremor in my hands, possibly caused by accumulated mercury exposure, affects not just my ability to write, but also simple tasks like lifting cups or handling small objects. More disturbing are the phantom tastes that occasionally overwhelm my senses without warning, flooding my mouth with the remembered flavors of substances I encountered years or even decades earlier. These episodes, which seem to be triggered by stress or particular combinations of foods, transport me instantly back to specific moments of danger and uncertainty that I had thought were safely confined to memory. The metallic tang of arsenic, the numbing sensation of nightshade derivatives, the subtle wrongness that marked sophisticated poison blends, all remain as vivid as if I were experiencing them for the first time. Sleep continues to be disrupted by dreams that feature elaborate banquets, where every dish transforms into something dangerous as I lift it toward my mouth. These nocturnal visions often include faces of conspirators from the great plot against Rameses III, their expressions twisted into masks of hatred and betrayal that follow me through endless corridors lined with tables bearing contaminated food. I wake from such dreams with my heart pounding and the taste of various poisons lingering on my tongue, despite having consumed nothing more dangerous than water since retiring from royal service. The psychological impact of having spent the most productive years of my adult life in constant anticipation of death has created a perspective on existence that feels both privileged and cursed. I have seen power exercised at its highest levels and witnessed the intimate details of how divine kingship functions in practice. But these experiences came at the cost of normal participation in human community and the simple pleasures that give meaning to ordinary life. Yet there remains a satisfaction in knowing that my vigilance helped preserve something ancient and valuable during a period when much of the known world was dissolving into chaos. The civilization of Egypt, with its traditions of learning, art, and religious practice, survived threats that destroyed other kingdoms and empires. My role in this preservation was small and largely unrecognized, but it was real and necessary in ways that give meaning to sacrifices that might otherwise seem merely tragic. The Shadow's End, As the sun sets over the Nile and the evening breeze carries the scent of lotus blossoms from the temple gardens, I find myself reflecting on the strange arc of a life spent tasting death so that others might live. The boy who left Memphis 32 years ago with dreams of honest service and modest advancement could never have imagined the path that awaited him, the knowledge he would be forced to acquire, or the burdens he would carry into old age. The skills I developed, the ability to detect poisons in concentrations so small they barely registered on human senses, the psychological resilience needed to function under constant threat, the deep understanding of palace intrigue and political conspiracy, were necessary for survival, but useful for little else. In retirement, they serve mainly as reminders of experiences that separated me from normal human community and left me marked by forms of knowledge that few would envy. Picture yourself at the end of such a journey, possessing expertise that could save lives but having no opportunity to use it. Carrying memories that could illuminate historical events while being unable to share them. Understanding the intimate workings of power while remaining forever excluded from its exercise. The paradoxes of my situation reflect broader truths about service and sacrifice that extend far beyond my particular circumstances. The tremor in my hands makes writing increasingly difficult, and I suspect these words may be among the last I manage to record before physical limitations make such efforts impossible. If these memories survive me, they will serve as testimony to experiences that official histories will never acknowledge. The daily reality of life lived in service to power. The human cost of preserving civilization during periods of existential threat, and the strange courage required to face potential death as a matter of professional routine. The taste of that final wine, perfect, untainted, safe, remains with me as a symbol of what normal existence might have been like if circumstances had been different. But circumstances were what they were, and the path I followed was the one that events made necessary. In the end, perhaps that is enough. To have served faithfully, to have helped preserve something valuable, and to have found meaning in experiences that would otherwise be merely tragic. The shadow of the royal food taster grows long as evening approaches, stretching across papyrus and memory toward whatever lies beyond the service of kings and the taste of death. In this twilight, I am finally free to be simply human again, though the man who emerges from 3 decades in the shadow of the throne bears scars that will never fully heal and carries knowledge that will die with him in the desert's silence of eternity. Imagine, if you can, the weight of such knowledge fading into silence, the accumulated wisdom of survival becoming dust, and the taste of empire dissolving on a tongue that has known too much of both poison and power. This is how empires truly end. Not with the clash of bronze or the fall of walls, but with the quiet extinction of those who knew their intimate secrets and carried their burdens in shadow and silence. The taste lingers still. Epilogue: The Scribe's Discovery. Found among the personal effects of Kieti, former royal food taster, upon his death in the 28th year of Ramesses IV's reign. Recorded by Amenhotep, temple scribe of Ptah at Memphis, for the archives of the House of Life. The old man died as he had lived his final years. Quietly, without fanfare, in the small estate near Memphis that had been his reward for 3 decades of service that few knew about and fewer still understood. His body was discovered by servants who had grown concerned when he failed to appear for his usual morning walk through the gardens, where he cultivated herbs with the obsessive care of someone who had spent a lifetime studying the properties of plants. The chamber where death found him contained the tools of his final occupation: reed pens worn smooth by years of use, jars of ink prepared according to recipes he had learned from his father, and neat stacks of papyrus covered with hieroglyphic text that recorded experiences no official chronicle would ever acknowledge. The tremor that had made writing increasingly difficult was evident in the gradually deteriorating quality of the script, yet he had persisted in his documentation until physical limitation made continuation impossible. His funeral was attended by a small gathering that reflected the isolation which had marked his retirement years. A few neighbors came out of courtesy. Temple priests performed the necessary rituals with professional competence, and several elderly palace servants made the journey from Pyrameses to honor a colleague whose work had protected them all, though indirectly. No members of the royal family attended, as would have been appropriate for someone whose service had been both crucial and deliberately invisible. The mummification process, paid for from the modest wealth he had accumulated through royal grants, was performed according to traditions that had remained unchanged for millennia. Yet even in death, his body bore the marks of his unusual profession: stomach tissues scarred by decades of poison exposure, bones showing mineral deposits consistent with chronic heavy metal contamination, and organs that displayed the accumulated damage of substances no human frame was designed to process repeatedly. Picture the embalmer's surprise as they encountered physical evidence of a life lived under conditions they had never imagined, reading in flesh and bone the story of someone who had sacrificed his body's integrity in service to powers they could only worship from a distance. Their professional discretion ensured that these discoveries remained confidential, but the unusual nature of the damage required explanations that gradually revealed the true scope of Keaty's service to the kingdom. The archive's secret: the papyrus scrolls found in Katie's possession presented immediate challenges to those responsible for managing his estate. The content was clearly significant: detailed accounts of palace life, political conspiracies, and security procedures that had protected Egypt's rulers during a critical period. Yet the sensitive nature of these revelations made it impossible to treat them as ordinary historical documents that could be copied and distributed according to standard archival procedures. After consultation with temple authorities and surviving palace officials who had served during Ramesses III's reign, the decision was made to preserve the scrolls in the restricted archives of the House of Life at Memphis, where they would be accessible only to scholars with specific authorization from both religious and royal authorities. This arrangement balanced the historical value of Katie's testimony against the security considerations that had originally required his experiences to remain secret. The process of copying and preserving these fragile documents revealed additional details about the author's final years that were not immediately apparent from casual reading. Marginal notes, written in a different ink, and with the shakier handwriting that marked his declining health, showed continued efforts to refine and expand his account, even as physical limitations made writing increasingly difficult. Some passages had been revised multiple times, with earlier versions scraped away and overwritten as Katie struggled to find language adequate to convey experiences that existed primarily as sensory memories and emotional responses. The inadequacy of written communication to capture the full reality of his service became increasingly apparent as he worked to transform lived experience into words that others might understand. The final entries, barely legible due to the severity of his hand tremor, contained reflections on mortality and meaning that suggested he had found some measure of peace with the choices circumstances had forced upon him. References to dreams that had become less troubled, to phantom tastes that visited him less frequently, and to a growing acceptance of his unique place in Egypt's history, indicated that the act of recording his memories had provided a form of psychological healing that decades of solitary reflection had failed to achieve. The kingdom's transformation. The Egypt that survived Ramesses III's reign, preserved in part through Katie's vigilance, continued to face the challenges that had made his services necessary, while adapting to new threats and opportunities that emerged as the Mediterranean world gradually stabilized after the chaos of the Sea People's invasions. The kingdom's transformation from dominant regional power to defensive survivor required adjustments that affected every aspect of Egyptian society. The royal court, traumatized by the conspiracy that had nearly succeeded in destroying the dynasty, implemented security measures that made Katie's already elaborate precautions seem almost casual by comparison. Future food tasters worked in teams that provided redundant protection, while kitchen operations were reorganized according to procedures designed to eliminate any possibility of coordinated poisoning attempts. Yet these enhanced protections came at the cost of the intimate court life that had characterized earlier periods of Egyptian history. The spontaneous gatherings, informal meals, and casual interactions between rulers and subjects that had once marked royal households became impossible under security regimens designed to prevent any repetition of organized assassination attempts. The provincial administration, weakened by the conspiracy's revelation of how extensively disloyalty had penetrated government structures, underwent reorganization that centralized authority in ways that reduced local autonomy while increasing royal control over regional officials. These changes helped prevent future conspiracies, but also eliminated much of the flexibility that had previously allowed Egypt to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Temple hierarchies, implicated in various aspects of the plot against Ramesses III, faced increased scrutiny and reduced independence as pharaohs sought to prevent religious institutions from accumulating enough power to threaten royal authority. The balance between secular and sacred power that had characterized Egyptian civilization for millennia shifted decisively in favor of royal control, with long-term consequences that would shape the kingdom's development for centuries. The taster's legacy. The knowledge that Katie had accumulated through 3 decades of service to the crown survived his death in forms that extended beyond his written memoirs, preserved through the training he had provided to younger tasters and the security procedures he had helped develop. His insights into poison detection, political conspiracy, and the psychology of assassination became institutional knowledge that protected subsequent rulers, even as the specific details of his service faded from active memory. The techniques he had refined for identifying various categories of toxins were incorporated into training protocols, used by palace security throughout the remaining years of the New Kingdom and beyond. His systematic approach to evaluating potential threats, based on careful observation of behavioral patterns and environmental changes, influenced security procedures that extended far beyond food tasting to encompass broader aspects of royal protection. The conspiracy he had helped expose became a case study used by later generations of security officials, though the specific details of his role were gradually obscured by the passage of time and the tendency of official records to emphasize institutional responses rather than individual contributions. His name disappeared from most accounts of the events, replaced by generic references to palace security or protective measures that concealed the human cost of maintaining royal safety. Yet among the small community of royal food tasters who served subsequent pharaohs, Kheti's memory was preserved with something approaching veneration. Stories of his expertise, his courage in the face of the Great Conspiracy, and his survival of 3 decades in a position that killed most practitioners within years, became legendary among those who understood the true nature of the challenges he had faced. The physical artifacts of his service, the silver spoons he had used for testing, the golden cups that had held potentially lethal beverages, the ceramic bowls that had contained suspicious foods, were preserved in palace treasuries as objects that carried both practical and symbolic significance. These items served as tools for training future tasters, while also functioning as reminders of the dedication required for effective service in protecting royal lives. The empire's twilight, the Egypt that Kheti had helped preserve through his vigilance and sacrifice, continued to face the inexorable pressures that would eventually transform it from an independent kingdom into a province of successive foreign empires. The challenges that had made his services necessary, external military threats, internal political instability, economic pressures that strained traditional social structures, persisted and intensified as the Mediterranean world continued its transformation. The Sea Peoples, though defeated in their initial assault on Egypt, established themselves in territories throughout the eastern Mediterranean, where they continued to disrupt trade networks and diplomatic relationships that had sustained Egyptian prosperity for centuries. The Philistines in Palestine, the various groups that settled in Syria and Anatolia, and the maritime raiders who made naval commerce increasingly dangerous, all represented ongoing threats to Egypt's economic foundation. Internal pressures proved equally persistent and perhaps more dangerous in the long term. The priesthood of Amun at Thebes, though temporarily subdued by the conspiracy's exposure, gradually rebuilt its power base and resumed its challenge to royal authority. Provincial governors, faced with increasing difficulty in collecting taxes and maintaining order in their territories, became increasingly independent in practice, if not in official status. The military, strained by decades of defensive warfare and deprived of the tribute and plunder that had supported earlier armies, struggled to maintain the professional standards and loyalty that effective royal protection required. Veterans of successful campaigns against foreign enemies found themselves reduced to internal security duties that offered less glory and fewer rewards than the conquests that had built Egypt's empire. Economic pressures, exacerbated by the disruption of trade networks and the cost of maintaining elaborate security measures, created social tensions that affected every level of Egyptian society. The wealthy found their resources stretched by increased taxation and reduced income from foreign commerce, while common people faced shortages of imported goods and increased demands for labor on defensive projects.